I have been asked more than once why I never talk about what I found on the survey station. The honest answer is that I have talked about it 3 times under oath in closed session, before 2 separate review panels, and once before the combined Admiralty, and I filed 11 written reports in the 14 months between the discovery and the departure of the fleet. What I have not done is talk about it the way people seem to want, informally, retrospectively, with whatever emotion they are hoping to see on my face. I am not withholding anything. I simply ran out of emotion sometime around hour 40 of my first pass through the archive. And what filled the space afterward was something quieter and far more durable, and that is what I have to offer. My name is Dia Rhodes. I was a warrant officer, 2nd class, assigned to the 9th Intelligence Cell of the combined Colonial Authority at the time of the discovery. I am retired now. I have been retired for 6 years. I still wake up at 0400 because that is when I woke up every day for 11 years, and I do not think that will change. I make coffee, I look at the water, I think about the archive. Here is what I found. The Calvari Dominion had been operating in the outer colonial rings for 31 years before we decoded their survey station's records. 31 years is a long time to do something terrible without being caught. It is long enough that the operation becomes routine, becomes, from the inside, administrative. The records we found reflected that. They were tidy, cross-indexed, annotated with the kind of precision that belongs to a people who have never considered that their record-keeping might one day be used against them, because they never considered that they could be held accountable for what those records described. The Calvari did not hide what they had done. They documented it with the same dispassion they applied to mapping stellar drift patterns and cataloging mineral deposits. To them, those activities in this one occupied the same category of work. The category was resource assessment. I need you to understand what I mean when I say that before I tell you what was in the archive, because the framing matters. The Calvari were not, and I want to be precise about this, ideologically opposed to humanity. They did not hate us. They did not fear us. They were not pursuing some religious or territorial agenda. They were a civilization organized around data. Their highest cultural value was what translates roughly as complete knowledge of a thing, a kind of compulsive thoroughness that ran through every aspect of their society, from the way they structured their governance, to the way they prepared food, to the way they approached xenobiological study. When the Calvari encountered a new life form, they studied it until they understood it completely. They did not consider this optional. They considered it the defining obligation of an intelligent species. What they found when they arrived at the edge of our colonial space was an organism they did not yet completely understand. That is all we were to them. An organism they did not yet completely understand. I want to be very precise about this because I have seen the discovery reported in various popular accounts as a story about hatred or cruelty or sadistic pleasure, and none of those framings are accurate. The Calvari did not torture anyone. They did not take pleasure in what they did. They took, in a very literal sense, notes. They collected specimens. They performed what they called full-spectrum biological integration surveys, a term that means, in practice, systematic dissection. And they logged the results in an archive that ran, by the time we decoded it, to approximately 4 million individual data entries across 46 separately indexed catalogs. The oldest entries dated to 31 years before we found the station. The most recent entry had been logged 9 hours before our boarding team cut through the station's outer hull. The Calvari survey team aboard that station had been, up to the moment we arrived, still working. I was not part of the boarding team. I arrived with the second wave, 6 hours after the station had been secured, tasked with assessing the archive before the Calvari crew was transferred to a holding facility on Outpost Varen. I came aboard carrying a portable decryption terminal, a field translation rig, and the standard kit for a cold assessment, which is the intelligence community's term for a site exploitation where you do not know what you are, going to find, and you try to approach the task without assumption or anticipation, because assumption and anticipation are ways of missing things. I had done cold assessments before. I had found arms caches. I had found communications logs. I had found once evidence of a financial fraud scheme so elaborate that reconstructing it Took our office 4 months and still produced indictments. I had not found anything like the Kelvari archive. The decryption took 9 hours. I worked alone, which is my preference on cold assessments, because other people's reactions interfere with my concentration. When the first catalog opened, I spent 20 minutes reading the index before I understood what I was looking at. The catalog was organized by what the Kelvari called sample acquisition sequence, meaning the order in which specimens had been collected, and each entry consisted of a sample number, a date, an acquisition location, a biological classification tag, and a link to what the Kelvari's indexing system labeled as integration record. That term did not translate cleanly on the first pass. My translation rig rendered it as full study file, and I had to flag it and return to it later. When I had enough context to understand that integration was the Kelvari's technical word for the process of breaking a living system down into its component parts in order to understand how those parts function together. The word they used for that process is the same word they used for understanding. To the Kelvari, those were the same thing. The biological classification tag in the first entry read, Terran hominid, variant colonial, sex, female, estimated age at acquisition, 34 standard years. Acquisition location, coordinates that I cross-referenced to the Crestfall Outer Ring settlements, Sector 7, a civilian farming colony of approximately 8,000 people that had reported 23 missing persons over a span of 4 years and had been told by the Colonial Authority that the disappearances were likely the result of equipment failures and industrial accidents, because that is the explanation that fits when people disappear in the outer rings, because the outer rings are dangerous, and we had not, at that time, been looking for a second explanation. I opened the integration record. I will not describe what was in it. Not because I am protecting you, but because the clinical precision of the documentation is something I do not think I can convey in conversational language, and any imprecision on my part would be worse than silence. What I will tell you is that the integration record was thorough. The Kelvari were thorough. The entry for this specimen was 114 pages long, illustrated with high-resolution imaging, annotated with the kind of care that academics lavish on work they expect to be cited for generations, and it ended, as every integration record in the archive ended, with a summary paragraph that assessed whether the specimen had yielded complete data or whether further specimens would be required to resolve outstanding questions. This one concluded that further specimens would be required. The summary was dated 2 months before the next acquisition entry. I closed the record. I opened the index. I scrolled. The catalog ran to 847 entries. That was one catalog of 46. I sat in front of my terminal for what the station's internal clock later told me was 11. Minutes before I reached for my field comm and opened a secure line to my commanding officer, Major Hal Tessier, who was aboard the CCA vessel, Ardent Current, holding position 4 kilometers off the station's port side. When Tessier answered, I had already framed in my mind the 3 facts I needed to convey in a way that would produce the response the situation required, which is to say a complete cessation of all non-essential activity and an immediate escalation to the highest available authority. I told him that the archive appeared to contain biological records on human subjects. I told him the preliminary sample count was in the tens of thousands. I told him that the records were consistent with systematic lethal dissection, conducted over a period of not less than 30 years, that the most recent entry was 9 hours old, and that the Kelvari crew currently in custody aboard the Ardent Current had been the ones making those entries. Tessier did not say anything for a moment. I could hear his breathing through the comm. Tens of thousands, he said. That's a preliminary figure. I need more time with the archive to give you a hard count. Give me a range. I looked at the index again. 46 catalogs. Average catalog length based on the first one. Approximately 1/800 entries. I told him between 70,000 and 90,000 individual files, with the caveat that some files might represent the same subject across multiple sessions, and some might represent non-human organisms misclassified. Under the Terran hominid tag during early Kelvari contact with our species, before their classification system had refined enough to distinguish us from related Terran fauna. Tessier said, continue the assessment. Touch nothing. Move nothing. Secure the original data storage medium before you do anything else. Already done, I said. I'm contacting command. I went back to the archive. The final count, which took me 40 hours to establish and another 12 to verify, was 311 individual human subjects. The date range ran from 31 years ago to 9 hours before boarding. The acquisition locations covered 63 separate colonial settlements across the outer rings, including 14 settlements that had never reported missing persons to the Colonial Authority. Because the Kelvari had learned, over time, to acquire their specimens from settlements large enough that a small number of disappearances could be absorbed into the background noise of industrial and agricultural accident statistics, and they had calibrated their acquisition rate accordingly. They were not trying to avoid detection because they thought what they were doing was wrong. They were trying to avoid detection because interference with ongoing research was inefficient, and the Kelvari abhorred inefficiency. The 311 subjects were distributed across the 46 catalogs according to the phase of study at the time of acquisition. Catalog 1, which was the oldest, contained subjects from the earliest acquisition period and represented what the Kelvari classified as initial orientation, phase work, meaning the first generation of specimens, whose integration records were comparatively short because the Kelvari were still developing their analytical frameworks for human biology and had not yet determined which questions were most productive to pursue. By Catalog 46, which contained the most recent subjects, the integration records ran to an average of 340 pages each, cross-referenced to earlier catalog entries, annotated with queries for future research, and in some cases flagged for comparative re-examination of earlier specimens on specific anatomical questions that had arisen during later work. The archive was not a collection of crimes. The archive was a research program, ongoing, internally consistent, intellectually rigorous by the standards of the people who built it, and prosecuted across 3 decades with the patient diligence of people who believed absolutely in what they were doing and had no framework within which to consider that they should stop. I finished the count at hour 52. I ate something. I slept for 4 hours on the floor of the assessment room, which is against protocol, but which Tessier did not mention in his incident report. Before I slept, I made a decision that I included in my first report and that I want to record here because I think it matters. I decided that I would not speak to the Kelvari crew in custody aboard the Ardent Current until I had finished the archive. I made this decision for reasons that were partly professional. You do not contaminate an archive assessment with interview data before the assessment is complete because interviews color interpretation, partly because I did not trust myself to conduct a productive interview until I knew exactly what I was asking about. I needed the full shape of the thing before I could speak to anyone who had made it. When I woke up, verified the count, and written the first report, I requested a transfer to the Ardent Current. Tessier approved it within the hour. I was aboard the ship and in the holding section by mid-afternoon station time. There were 7 Kelvari in custody. I want to describe the Kelvari for the record because popular accounts have tended toward extremes, either dehumanizing them in ways that are inaccurate or treating their appearance as somehow mitigating, which is also inaccurate. The Kelvari are bilaterally symmetrical, bipedal, and of roughly comparable size to a large human adult. Their faces are organized around 4 sensory clusters rather than 2. They have what functions as a second pair of optical sensors positioned laterally, giving them a field of view closer to 300 degrees than our 180. And their hands have 6 digits, the outer 2 of which are opposable in both directions. They are, by the standards of xenobiology, not particularly alien in their physical organization. You can read them. You can see when they are calm and when they are agitated and when they are processing something difficult. The 7 in the holding section appeared calm. 2 of them were reviewing documents on a data pad they had been permitted to retain. 3 were in conversation with each other. 2 were sleeping, or performing whatever the Kelvari equivalent of sleep is. None of them appeared distressed. This is not a criticism, exactly. I noted it. I conducted the interviews with the help of a translation specialist named Warrant Officer Pete Cahal, who had more hours of Kelvari language work than anyone else in the intelligence cell, and who was, by his own description, a man with complete professional detachment from whatever the conversation was about, a quality I valued and which proved accurate. We interviewed the 7 crew members over 3 days. The interviews were long, and the Kelvari were cooperative, which I expected. They had already, through their diplomatic channel, confirmed the nature of the survey program and offered their research data, which is not the behavior of people who believe they have something to hide. The senior survey officer, her name, in transliterated form, approximates to something like Veth Oren, and she held a rank that Kahal rendered as Chief Research Director, was the most forthcoming. She spoke about the survey program with the clarity of someone describing a project they are proud of, and I use that word deliberately. She was proud. Not in a gloating sense, not in a sense that contained any awareness of how the description was landing, but in the way that a person who has dedicated a significant portion of their professional life to a piece of work is proud of that work. The pride of investment and expertise, and the satisfaction of a difficult task executed well. She had been aboard the survey station for 11 years. She had been involved in the Quiet Harvest program for 18. She told me that the program was, in her view, the most significant xenobiological study ever undertaken within the Kelvari Dominion's research history, and that the dataset was uniquely valuable because of its longitudinal scope. 31 years of consistent methodology across a single species allowed for developmental tracking that shorter studies could not achieve. She told me that the Kelvari had, at various points in the program's history, considered broadening it to include other colonial species, but had concluded that maintaining methodological consistency with the Terran hominid study took priority, and that the data set would be compromised by interruption. She told me that she had personally authored or co-authored 847 of the integration records in the archive. I asked her, at one point, whether she had ever considered that the subjects of those records had families. She thought about this for a moment, not because the question troubled her. I could see that it did not, but because she was taking it seriously as a question, in the way that a thoughtful person takes seriously a question from an interlocutor they respect. She said that of course she understood that Terran hominids maintain social groupings organized around biological kinship and long-term partnership bonds, and that the acquisition of a member of such a grouping would create what she called a disruption in the grouping's relational network. She said this was a known variable. She said that the program had been designed, in part, to minimize the clustering of acquisitions within any single social grouping, specifically to prevent disruptions large enough to generate coordinated attention from the colonial authorities. They had thought about families. They had thought about families in the way an engineer thinks about load-bearing tolerances, as a parameter to be managed, a constraint to be respected to the minimum necessary degree to prevent interference with the work. I thanked her for her cooperation and ended the interview. I went back to my assessment notes and I sat for a while and I thought about the 11 minutes I had spent looking at the index before calling Tessier, and I thought about the 40 hours of verification, and I thought about the 4 million data entries, and I thought about Veth Oren sitting in a holding room on a human ship, calm, cooperative, proud of her work, genuinely unable to understand what the problem was. And I thought about what it meant that the Kelvari had spent 31 years studying us, still, in that fundamental way, knew nothing about us at all. I wrote that up in my first report. I wrote it as flatly as I could, because the flatness was more accurate than anything with feeling in it would have been. I transmitted it to the Ardent Current under Crimson Seal, and I filed the interview recordings alongside it, and I noted in the summary that the Kelvari crew had been fully cooperative, that nothing in their statements deviated from what the archive contained, and that they appeared to hold no awareness of wrongdoing. That last line is the most important line in the report. I stood by it in every subsequent panel appearance, and I stand by it now. It is not exculpatory, it is diagnostic. A species that can prosecute a 31-year program of lethal research on 40,000 human beings and arrive at the other end of it with no awareness of wrongdoing is not a species that can be corrected by a fine or a sanction or a diplomatic resolution or any other tool in the piece architecture's toolbox. It is a species that has shown you, with extraordinary completeness and over an extraordinary span of time, exactly what it is. You do not need to infer. You do not need to argue from limited evidence. You have 46 catalogs in two, 4 million data entries, all of it produced by the species in question, all of it coherent, all of it consistent, and all of it pointing in one direction. I wrote the first report. I wrote 10 more over the following 14 months. And what was done with the reports, and what the reports were used to justify, I stand behind as fully as I stand behind every word in the reports themselves. When I woke up that first time, after my 4 hours on the assessment room floor and verified the count one more time, I transmitted the report to the Ardent Current under the highest available classification code, which at that time was Crimson Seal, a designation I had never used before and have not used since. Because Crimson Seal is reserved for information that, in the judgment of the transmitting officer, constitutes an existential threat to the stability of the combined Colonial Authority and the peace architecture supporting it. 40,000 human beings, systematically killed and studied over 31 years, each assigned a specimen number. If that is not an existential threat to the peace architecture, I do not know what is. The Calvari Dominion, when the Colonial Authority's initial inquiry reached them through the Conclave's diplomatic channels. A process that took 3 weeks, because the Conclave's diplomatic channels were designed for exactly this kind of incident, to provide a structured pathway between offense and response that allowed cooler heads to prevail, did not deny what the archive contained. They confirmed it. They explained, in precise and entirely coherent terms, that the survey program had been authorized under Calvari Dominion internal research protocols, that those protocols predated the Calvari's membership in the conclave, that the subjects in question had been acquired in what the Calvari classified as unclaimed peripheral space on the basis of survey maps that predated the formal chartering of the colonial settlements in question, and that the Calvari Dominion considered the matter to be an internal administrative question rather than a diplomatic one. They did not apologize. They expressed in the diplomatic cable that their conclave representative transmitted to the Colonial Authority what translates as a form of regret, but the Calvari word used in that context means, more precisely, the acknowledgement that a process has produced friction. It is the word they use when a piece of equipment malfunctions. It is not the word they use when they believe they have done something wrong, because they did not believe they had done something wrong. They believed they had encountered a boundary condition, a situation in which their internal protocols had produced an outcome that generated friction with an external party. And they were communicating, through the diplomatic channel, their willingness to discuss the modification of future protocols to reduce the likelihood of similar friction. They offered to share the research data with the Colonial Authority. I was not present in the room when that cable arrived. I was aboard the Ardent Current, completing my final verification runs on the archive data. But Tessier was there, and he told me about it afterward. Not in detail, just the fact of it, and the silence that followed in the room when the Colonial Authority's senior liaison officer read out the relevant passage. He said the silence lasted for a very long time. He said it was the particular silence of people who have understood something with complete clarity and are taking a moment to confirm that they have understood it correctly before they decide what to do with the understanding. What they had understood was this: the Calvari were not wrong by their own framework. They had not made a mistake. They had not acted in bad faith. They had acted in perfect accordance with their own values and their own logic. And those values and that logic produced, as a natural output, the systematic abduction and dissection of 40,000 human beings. And the Calvari saw no reason that this output should be treated any differently from any other output of a well-designed research program. The friction, in their view, was a problem of insufficient coordination. The solution was better coordination. They were open to discussing a memorandum of understanding regarding future research subjects. The Colonial Authority did not respond to that cable through diplomatic channels. The Colonial Authority transmitted, through the Conclave's standard communication relay, a single sentence acknowledgement. Message received. and then the Colonial Authority went quiet for 18 months. I want to describe those 18 months accurately because there is a version of this story in circulation that describes what followed as a decision made in passion, or in haste, or in grief that overwhelmed judgment. That version is wrong. I know it is wrong because I was part of the process that produced what followed, and what I observed was not passion, not haste, not grief overflowing its banks. What I observed was the most deliberate thing I have seen in my life, and I have been watching deliberate people do deliberate things for 22 years. The decision was made within 72 hours of the cable's arrival. I know this because Tessier told me 4 years later that the senior officer he had been in the room with when the cable was read, whose name I will not record here because she has asked that it not be, made the call to her own superiors within 4 hours of reading it, and that the chain of authorization moved from there to the Colonial Authority's full council in a session that lasted 6 hours and reached a unanimous vote before it adjourned. Tessier said that what struck him, listening to the recordings of that session afterward, and he had clearance to access those recordings, I did not, was the absence of debate. Not because the council members were incurious or unthinking, but because the decision was, in the view of everyone in that room, obvious. The Calvari Dominion had conducted a 31-year program of systematic lethal research on 40,000 human beings. They had told the Colonial Authority saw nothing wrong with this. The Colonial Authority was going to respond. The only question was the shape of the response, and that question was also answered quickly. The Calvari Dominion maintained a home system with a primary inhabited world, 4 subsidiary colony worlds, and 11 research installations distributed across their territorial space. Their total population was approximately 14 billion. Their defense forces consisted of approximately 6,000 combat vessels of various classes, supported by a network of fixed orbital defense platforms around their core worlds. Those numbers were well known. The Calvari were, like most conclave member states, transparent about their military capacity as a confidence-building measure. The combined human fleet, at the time of the council vote, consisted of approximately 340,000 combat-rated warships. That was the shape of the response. The Covenant of Ruin was the operational designation assigned to the fleet and its orders. I did not know that name for the first 9 months of the planning process because I was working in a compartmented intelligence cell, and operational designations are not shared across compartments. What I knew was my piece of it. Target confirmation, site assessment, integration of Calvari archive data into targeting packages, and the work of translating the clinical records of the Quiet Harvest. That was the name given to the Calvari's program in internal Colonial Authority documents, and it was a better name than the Calvari's own, which was Terran Hominid Integration Survey. Phase 1 through Phase 31, into the kind of concrete, specific, undeniable evidentiary record that would stand up to every form of scrutiny that any party might later wish to apply. We were thorough about this. The Calvari had been thorough, and we were thorough in response, and I think the parallel is not accidental. If they were going to document 40,000 deaths with the precision of scientists, then we were going to document the documentation with the precision of prosecutors, and every page we generated would be as airtight and as unanswerable as every page they had generated, and when it was done, there would be no version of events in which the record was unclear. The team I worked with during those 9 compartmented months was 6 people. I want to mention them by name because they deserve the record. Major Hal Tessier, who ran the cell, Warrant Officer Pete Cahal, the translation specialist, Senior Analyst Maren Voss, Technical Warrant Dury Haas, who handled archive data systems, and 2 Colonial Authority lawyers on secondment, whose names I have been asked not to include here because they are still active, and I will respect that. 6 people. For 9 months, those 6 people were the ones who knew the full shape of what was coming and who were building the evidentiary foundation that would make it unassailable. I want to describe what that work actually looked like because I think the description matters for people who imagine the planning of something like the Covenant of Ruin as a dramatic or ceremonial process. It was not. It was 9 months of exactly the kind of work I had always done, scaled up and made heavier by the weight of what it was documenting. I sat in front of terminals. I reviewed archive entries. I cross-referenced acquisition coordinates against Colonial Authority settlement records and population databases. I wrote and rewrote and revised summaries and briefs and evidentiary indexes. Marin Voss worked the victim identification track in parallel, trying to match specimen numbers to names, which required pulling records from 63 different colonial settlement databases, cross-referencing estimated acquisition dates against reported missing records and mortality records, and records of people who had simply stopped appearing in administrative systems without explanation, and working through the cases where there was no record at all, because the Kelvari had calibrated their acquisitions carefully enough that some of the 40,000 people had never been reported missing. They had been small losses absorbed into background noise. The Colonial Authority systems had closed their files as inconclusive. Marin identified 28,441 subjects by name. The remaining 11,870 were assigned status codes and referred to a standing inquiry board that was still working when I retired. I assume it is still working now. Dury Haas spent 3 months building a chain of custody certification system for the archive data, not because anyone was likely to challenge its provenance, since the Kelvari had confirmed everything, but because we built it as if someone would challenge it, as if every piece of evidence would be scrutinized by the most hostile possible review panel at some future point, and we wanted to be ready. The lawyers on secondment reviewed the evidentiary standards of the conclave's own arbitration, procedures, the standards of the Colonial Authority's judicial system, and the standards of 6 other galactic legal frameworks, and they drafted guidelines for the documentation that met or exceeded all of them. We were not going to give anyone a technical escape route. This is what it looks like, I think, when grief becomes something useful. Not when grief produces action in the immediate sense, the hot reaction, the impulse, the thing that happens before thought can intercede. But when grief has been sitting in a person long enough that it stops being grief and starts being a form of precision. We were precise. We were more precise than we might otherwise have been about any task, because the task was this task, because the names in the index were real names, and the specimen numbers were real people, and the integration records were real records of real deaths, and no imprecision was acceptable. The precision was the only thing we had to offer them. When my compartment was merged into the operational cell, 7 months in, and I learned the designation and the scale, the first thing I did was ask Dury Haas to run a check on whether our targeting data for the Kelvari research installations was current. He spent a week on it. That is when we found the relocation I mentioned later, the installation that had moved 4 months before the operation. Finding it early meant we had time to correct the package, which we did. Nothing was left out. That was the standard we held throughout. That was when I learned the designation and the scale. I remember sitting in the briefing where the fleet composition was presented. We were in a planning facility on Varen Station, a room with no windows, bad air circulation, and a holo display that took up most of one wall, and watching the fleet manifest scroll. I had spent 7 months thinking about 40,000 names, 40,000 specimen numbers, 40,000 integration records. The manifest was shorter, 340,000 individual combat vessel IDs, organized by class and assigned sector, and the scroll took approximately 4 minutes at normal reading speed. I watched it the way you watch something you know you will want to be able to remember exactly. The planning process was 18 months from council vote to fleet departure. During those 18 months, the Colonial Authority maintained normal diplomatic relations with the Kelvari Dominion through the conclave. They attended conclave sessions. They participated in procedural votes. They exchanged routine administrative communications with the Kelvari representative. The Kelvari, by every account we have, interpreted this normalcy as an indication that the Colonial Authority had accepted their framing of the situation and was moving toward the memorandum of understanding they had proposed. There are records, Kelvari internal records, which we captured later, indicating that the Kelvari representative to the conclave filed 3 progress reports during those 18 months, characterizing the diplomatic track as proceeding satisfactorily and moving toward productive resolution. I have thought about this more than I have thought about almost anything else. The Kelvari were, in their own way, watching. They watched the channels they knew how to watch, processed the signals they knew how to process, applied the frameworks they had built over centuries of diplomatic practice, and concluded from what they observed that the situation was stable. They were watching as carefully as their instruments and their experience allowed them to watch. There is something in that, I think, about the limits of any system that processes the world only in terms of the categories it already has. The Covenant of Ruin departed from its assembly points, distributed across 14 staging locations, to prevent any single point of observation from capturing the scale of what was forming. On a morning I was not present for, because my role in the operational phase was as a forward intelligence officer aboard one of the fleet's 18 command vessels, and command vessels departed 12 hours after the main body, as is standard. When my ship, the Seekis Reckoning Ledger, broke from its dock and ran through its final systems check, the main fleet was already 8 hours ahead of us, and I stood at my station on the intelligence deck, watching the course plots populate across the situational display, and I counted ships the way I had spent a year counting names. I want to describe the transit as I experienced it, which was largely as a sequence of watches and data reviews, and the particular quality of silence that settles over a large ship when its crew has understood the weight of where it is going. We were in transit for 11 days. During those 11 days, I worked my standard watch rotation, reviewed targeting packages, cross-referenced Kelvari settlement data against the acquisition location records from the archive, and ate 3 meals a day in the officers' mess, where conversation was possible but rarely sustained. The Reckoning Ledger had a crew of 1,400. Most of them knew what the operation was, and most of them had known for some time. There was nothing unusual in anyone's behavior. There was no excessive drinking, no unusual tension, no breakdown of discipline, and also none of the thing that sometimes appears in crew. Populations before a major operation, the keyed up, forward-leaning energy that reads as excitement even when no one intends it that way. There was none of that. What there was instead was something I can only describe as settled. The crew of the Reckoning Ledger had been told where they were going, and why in more detail than is usual before an operation of this kind, because the Colonial Authority had decided that the people who were going to carry out the Covenant of Ruin deserved what the Covenant of Ruin was. They had been given access to the executive summary of my reports. Some of them, I was told, had asked for more, had asked to read the full reports or portions of the archive record, and some of that access had been granted where it was operationally feasible. I do not know what those individual crew members made of what they read. I did not ask. I do not think asking would have been useful or appropriate. What I observed was the result of it, which was a ship of one, 400 people moving through 11 days of transit with the steadiness of people who know exactly what they are going toward and have decided, each one privately, that going toward it is right. On the 4th day of transit, a crew member I did not know, a young engine technician, maybe 22 years old, with the look of someone who had not been doing this for very long, stopped me in a corridor on my way from the mess to the intelligence deck. He stopped me because he had recognized me from somewhere, probably a briefing recording, and wanted to say something. I could see him working up to it, and I waited. He said, "Were there children in the archive?" I told him yes. He nodded. He did not say anything else. He moved on down the corridor. I moved on to the intelligence deck. There were 3,847 children in the archive. The youngest entry in the archive was a child of 4 years, acquired in the 23rd year of the program, whose integration record ran to 92 pages. I have never discussed that entry publicly, and I am not going to discuss it now. It is in the reports. It is in the record. Anyone who needs to know can find it. I do not need to say more about it than that it exists, and that I have read it, and that the 92 pages were thorough, because the Kelvari were thorough. On the 11th day, the Kelvari home system appeared on our long-range sensors. The main fleet had been holding position at the system's outer edge for 9 hours by the time we arrived. From the command deck's situational display, I could see them. 340,000 ships in a formation that defies easy description, because there is no visual referent in ordinary experience for what 340 Zero warships look like when they are organized into a coherent tactical formation. The closest I can come is this. The formation had weight to it, the way a geological feature has weight, the way a mountain range has weight, when you look at it from a distance and understand that it has been there for longer than you have and will be there after you are gone. The Calvari home world was visible at the center of the display, a pale amber sphere with cloud banding and a population of 9 billion people. And the fleet was between it and the outer system, and the disproportion was absolute. I had spent 18 months building part of the case that had produced that fleet. I had counted 340 zeros and ships manifest scrolling across a briefing display. I had known, intellectually, what 340,000 ships was. Seeing it on the situational display of a command vessel holding position at the outer edge of the Calvari home system, with the amber world in the center, and the formation around it like a second ring, beyond whatever natural rings the planet had, was different from knowing it intellectually in a way I find difficult to describe. I will try anyway, because I believe in trying. It was not awe, in the reverential sense. It was not excitement. It was not even, precisely, satisfaction, though that word is closer than the others. It was more like the feeling of looking at a completed proof, the sense that a very long sequence of carefully accumulated steps has arrived, finally and exactly at its last line, and the last line is correct, and the proof holds, all the way through, every step. From Catalog 1, Entry 1, to 340,000 ships in formation around an amber world. The proof held. The Calvari detected the fleet 7 minutes after we arrived at our position. I know this because their first communication came in 7 minutes and 43 seconds after the Reckoning Ledger's arrival logged in the fleet as positional database. The communication was directed to the Conclave Emergency Relay, not to the fleet directly, and it was a formal invocation of Article 14 of the Conclave Charter, which is the provision that allows any member state to request an emergency arbitration session in the event of what the Charter calls imminent conflict between member polities. The Calvari's invocation was detailed and precise, as everything the Calvari produced was detailed and precise. And it requested an immediate convening of the arbitration panel, a freeze on all fleet movements pending the panel's review, and the assignment of a neutral conclave mediator to facilitate dialogue between the Calvari Dominion and the Colonial Authority. The fleet did not stop. The Colonial Authority's response to the arbitration invocation was transmitted 40 minutes later through the same conclave relay. I was given access to it before transmission as part of my role, and I read it in full. It was, by the standards of diplomatic communication, extremely short. It acknowledged receipt of the invocation. It noted that the Colonial Authority was also a signatory to the Conclave Charter and was familiar with Article 14's provisions. It noted that Article 14's emergency arbitration provision applied, under the Charter's own language, to disputes arising from alleged violations of member state obligations and territorial agreements. And it stated, with the kind of flat precision that only becomes possible when you have spent 18 months preparing for the moment you are in, that the matter at issue was not a dispute about alleged violations. The matter at issue had been confirmed in documentary evidence of the Calvari Dominion's own making to be a 31-year program of systematic lethal research conducted on 40,000 human beings. The Colonial Authority attached to its response the executive summary of my 11 reports. It did not mention Article 14 again. The second Calvari communication arrived 40 minutes after the first. It repeated the arbitration request and added a new element. The Calvari offered to make all research data from the Quiet Harvest available to the Colonial Authority and to the Conclave as a demonstration of good faith and a basis for the development of agreed research protocols going forward. They noted that the data represented 31 years of work and constituted, in their assessment, the most comprehensive xenobiological study of any known species ever conducted, and they expressed confidence that the Colonial Authority would recognize the scientific value of this information and agree that its preservation was in both parties' interests. The fleet did not stop. I want to be careful about how I describe what followed, because the operational details of the engagement are part of the formal record, and my contribution to that record has already been made, and what I have to add here is not operational detail, but something else. The texture of the experience from where I was sitting, which was in front of a targeting display in the intelligence section of a command vessel that was, by that point, following the main fleet's entry vector toward the Kelvari home world. The Kelvari Defense Forces engaged. 6,000 ships is not a negligible force, and the Kelvari were not passive. They fought with the precision you would expect from a people who applied thoroughness to everything, including their own defense, and they extracted a cost. The Colonial Authority does not publish casualty figures from the Covenant of Ruin, and I will not provide them here, because they are not mine to provide, and because the relevant question, whether the operation was justified, does not hinge on them. What I will say is that the cost was real, and that the people who paid it were professionals who knew the risk before they boarded their ships, and that the 340,000 ships of the Covenant of Ruin were still 340,000 ships after the Kelvari Defense Forces had done everything they could do, because 340,000 ships and 6,000 ships are not a contest in any language. My role during the engagement was to maintain the targeting package database and flag any deviations between real-time sensor data and our preloaded assessments, to be, in the most literal sense, the person watching the instruments and making sure that what was happening matched what we had planned for, and to escalate anything that did not match. It is not a dramatic role. I was watching screens for most of it, updating logs, routing data queries from the engagement coordinators on the deck above me. I flagged 4 deviations. 3 were minor. One required an update to the targeting package for one of the Kelvari research installations because the installation had been relocated 4 months before the operation, and our most recent intelligence had not captured the relocation. I updated the package. The installation was added to the confirmed target list. The installation, I should note, was one of the 11 research facilities in the Kelvari territorial space. I had reviewed its archive entry during my assessment work on Verne Station. It had been operational for 22 years. Its primary function was xenobiological research. I updated the targeting package and confirmed the new coordinates and went on to the next log entry. There is a version of this that wants to be dramatic. I have no drama to offer. I was doing my job. What I can offer is this. At some point, during the second day of operations, when the main fleet's engagement with the Kelvari homeworld was in its later stages and secondary task forces were moving through the system, addressing the subsidiary targets. I had a period of approximately 40 minutes with no active tasking, no data queries to route, no deviations to flag, no package updates pending. The engagement coordinators were running smoothly. My chief officer had the watch. I was sitting at my station because leaving your station during active operations is not done, and I had nothing to do but look at the situational display. On the display, the Kelvari homeworld was amber. The cloud banding I had seen 11 days earlier was visible on the unaffected portions of the planet's surface. The engaged portions were different, visible as altered thermal signatures, as disrupted atmospheric patterns, as what a meteorologist looking at the data would describe as rapid surface modification events. The fleet's formation around the planet was visible as a field of ship returns, each one a small bright point. The whole mass of them dense enough that at the display's current scale, they merged into a continuous ring around the world. I thought about specimen number 1, the woman in Catalog 1, Entry 1, the 34-year-old from Sector 7, Crestfall Outer Ring. The first person the Kelvari had collected 31 years ago, before they had refined their methods, before they had developed the cross-indexing system that linked their later catalogs, before their integration records had grown to 340 pages. Her entry was 114 pages, and the Kelvari had noted that it was incomplete and that further specimens would be required. She had a Colonial Authority identification number. It had taken my team 4 months to match that identification number to a name, Elena Vass, agricultural surveyor, reported missing by her family 4 years after her actual acquisition date because the family had been told by the relevant Colonial Authority that she had likely died in a field accident in a remote sector, and the records were incomplete. And the match had been included? In my 8th report, the one that was specifically about identifiable subjects and the notification process for surviving family members, which was still ongoing, which would be ongoing for years. I looked at the display for the 40 minutes I had, and I thought about Elena Voss, and I did not feel anything in particular. I want to be honest about that. I had felt things during the assessment work and the planning process and the 18 months between. I had sat with my own reactions at various points, privately, and I had processed what I had found in the archive in whatever way one processes something like that. And by the time I was sitting in front of the display, watching the ring of ships around an amber world, there was nothing left to feel. It was not numbness, exactly. It was more like a kind of clarity, the clarity of a person who has looked at a thing for long enough that they have seen all the way through it to the back of it and know its full shape. The full shape of the thing was this. The Calvari had spent 31 years watching. They had been very careful watchers. They had watched and recorded and catalogued with extraordinary precision, and the 40,000 people they had watched had had no idea they were being watched and no idea what watching meant in the Calvari's hands. And we had spent 18 months watching too, watching the Calvari's diplomatic channels, maintaining the appearance of normalcy, watching them file their progress reports, and believe the situation was moving toward productive resolution. And the difference between the two kinds of watching was not technical. It was not a matter of instrumentation or analytical framework. The difference was that one kind of watching was an end in itself. The Calvari watched because watching was what they valued, because complete knowledge of a thing was their highest good, and the watching was sufficient. The watching was everything, and the other kind of watching was a preparation. We watched because we were getting ready. The watching was not the thing. What came after the watching was the thing. They never understood that about us. 31 years of study, 4 million data entries, and they never understood that. I wrote about this in my final report, which I submitted 6 weeks after the fleet returned to Colonial Authority space. It is the most personal thing I have ever written in an official document, and I do not know how much of it survives in the file, because reports are edited by the review process, and I was not given access to the final filed version. I hope the relevant sections survived. I think it matters for the historical record to have someone say clearly what the Calvari misunderstood, not because it changes what happened or what needed to happen, but because the misunderstanding is itself a kind of data, and I am, after all, a person who believes in complete records. The full engagement took 9 days. I was present for all 9. On the final day, when the task forces that had been working through the subsidiary colony worlds and research installations were filing their completion reports, I was asked by the operational cell's senior coordinator to prepare a consolidated targeting reconciliation, a document confirming that each target in the original package had been addressed and that no unintended targets had been included. This is standard final phase procedure. I spent 8 hours on it. When it was complete, I transmitted it up the chain and received in response the one-word acknowledgement that is standard in that context, confirmed. I filed my log for the day. I ate dinner. I went to my bunk and I lay in the dark for a while before I slept, which is not something I usually do. I am generally a person who falls asleep quickly. That night I lay there for what felt like a long time, looking at the underside of the bunk above me, and I thought for perhaps the last time about the archive. 40,000 specimen numbers, 31 years of complete, careful, thorough documentation. The Calvari had done their work with absolute commitment and had believed, up until the very end, that the work was good work, that it was the kind of work a serious civilization did, the kind of work that justified the investment of time and resources and the inevitable friction with less rigorous peoples who did not understand the value of complete knowledge. They had been watchers, and in the end, they had not been watching the right things. I slept. In the months that followed, I was asked several times by colleagues and superiors whether I thought the operation had been justified. It is a question I understand the impulse behind. We are people who think about justification, who take seriously the obligation to examine our actions against some standard, and the covenant of ruin was large enough that the question felt important to ask and answer carefully. I gave a consistent answer each time. I said that I had spent over a year inside the Calvari archive, that I had read the integration records of 311 human beings in as much detail as the work required, that I had matched identification numbers to names and corresponded with families, and written 11 reports trying to make the record as complete and as accurate as the Calvari's own records were complete and accurate, and that when I looked at what I had built on one side and what had been done in response, on the other side, I found the accounting straightforward. What I did not say, because it is not the kind of thing you say in official contexts, is this: the Calvari had spent 31 years watching 40,000 people very carefully and learning from them. We spent 9 days very carefully, ensuring that the Calvari would not watch anyone else. There is a precision to that. There is a completeness to it. I am not certain the Calvari would have failed to appreciate that if they had had any time to appreciate anything. 340,000 warships, one for every specimen number in the archive, with 30,000 to spare, because we had already built them, and because the math of disproportionate response does not require symmetry, it requires certainty. The certainty that nothing will be left undone. The certainty that the scale of the answer leaves no room for the question of whether it was answered at all. The Calvari had understood, better than almost any civilization we had encountered, the value of complete documentation. We documented our response at the same scale they had documented their program, and we did it with the same thoroughness and the same attention to accuracy and the same refusal to leave anything out. And when the documentation was complete, the thing it documented was complete. I was back on Varen Station 6 weeks after the fleet returned, finishing my final report. It was late. The station's day-night cycle had moved into its simulated night, and most of my colleagues had gone to whatever passed for rest in the months after an operation of that scale. I sat alone in the assessment room, a different assessment room from the one on the Calvari survey station, but similar enough in its essentials. A terminal, a chair, too cold air, the white noise of recycled atmosphere. I was writing the final paragraph of my final report, and I was thinking about Elena Voss, agricultural surveyor, Sector 7, Crestfall Outer Ring, and about what it means to be watched without knowing you are watched, and about the difference between the kind of knowledge that is only knowledge, that begins and ends in the watching, and the kind that prepares itself for what comes after. When I finished the paragraph, I submitted the report, shut down my terminal, and went to bed. I have not been back to that assessment room. I have been back many times to the archive. Not the physical medium that is in secure storage, but my own memory of it, the index, the 46 catalogs, the first entry, 114 pages, the woman from Crestfall, specimen number 1. I return to it the way you return to a thing you want to understand completely, which I suppose is a habit I picked up somewhere along the way, and which I cannot entirely account for, and which I do not expect to stop. It is the only habit I share with the Calvari. I do not think they would have found that interesting. I find it interesting enough for both of us.